Book the First, Chapter the First, Parts 4 through 6 of Tono-Bungay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tono-Bungay by H. G. Wells. Book the First, The Days Before Tono-Bungay Was Invented. Chapter the First, of Bladesover House and My Mother and the Constitution of Society. Part 4. I hated tea time in the housekeeper's room more than anything else at Bladesover, and more particularly I hated it when Mrs. Mackridge and Mrs. Booch and Mrs. Latude Fernay were staying in the house. They were all three of them pensioned-off servants. Old friends of Lady Drew's had rewarded them posthumously for a prolonged devotion to their minor comforts, and Mrs. Booch was also trustee of a favourite Skye terrier. Each year Lady Drew gave them an invitation, a reward and encouragement of virtue, with a special reference to my mother and Miss Fisson, the maid. They sat about in black and shiny and flouncy clothing, adorned with gimp and beads, eating great quantities of cake, drinking much tea in a stately manner, and reverberating remarks. I remember these women as immense. No doubt they were of negotiable size, but I was only a very little chap, and they have assumed nightmare proportions in my mind. They loomed, they bulged, they impended. Mrs. Mackridge was large and dark. There was a marvel about her head, inasmuch as she was bald. She wore a dignified cap, and in front of that, upon her brow, hair was painted. I have never seen the like since. She had been maid to the widow of Sir Roderick Blenderhassett Impey, some sort of governor or such like portent in the East Indies, and from her remains in Mrs. Mackridge, I judge Lady Impey was a very stupendous and crushing creature indeed. Lady Impey had been of the Juno type, haughty, unapproachable, given to irony and a caustic wit. Mrs. Mackridge had no wit, but she had acquired the caustic voice and gestures, along with the old satins and trimmings of the great lady. When she told you it was a fine morning, she seemed also to be telling you you were a fool and a low fool to boot. When she was spoken to, she had a way of acknowledging your poor tinkle of utterance with a voluminous, scornful "Huh!" that made you want to burn her alive. She also had a way of saying "Indeed," with a droop of the eyelids. Mrs. Booch was a smaller woman, brown-haired, with queer little curls on either side of her face, large blue eyes, and a small set of stereotyped remarks that constituted her entire mental range. Mrs. Latude Fernay had left, oddly enough, no memory at all, except her name and the effect of a green-grey silk dress, all set with gold and blue buttons. I fancy she was a large blonde. Then there was Miss Fisson, the maid who served both Lady Drew and Miss Somerville, and at the end of the table opposite my mother sat Rabbits the butler. Rabbits, for a butler, was an unassuming man, and at tea he was not as you know butlers, but in a morning coat and a black tie with blue spots. Still, he was large, with side whiskers, even if his clean-shaven mouth was weak and little. I sat among these people on a high, hard, early Gregorian chair, trying to exist like a feeble seedling amidst great rocks, and my mother sat with an eye upon me, resolute to suppress the slightest manifestation of vitality. It was hard on me, but perhaps it was also hard upon these rather overfed, aging, pretending people that my youthful restlessness and rebellious, unbelieving eyes should be thrust in among their dignities. Tea lasted for nearly 3/4 of an hour, and I sat it out perforce, and day after day the talk was exactly the same. "Sugar, Mrs. Mackridge?" my mother used to ask. "Sugar, Mrs. Latude Fernay?" The word sugar would stir the mind of Mrs. Mackridge. "They say," she would begin, issuing her proclamation. At least half her sentences began, "They say." "Sugar is fattening nowadays. Many of the best people do not take it at all." "Not with their tea, Mum," said Rabbits intelligently. "Not with anything," said Mrs. Mackridge, with an air of crushing repartee, and drank. "What won't they say next?" said Miss Fison. "They do say such things," said Mrs. Booch. "They say," said Mrs. Mackridge inflexibly, "the doctors are not recommending it now." My mother. "No, ma'am?" Mrs. Mackridge. "No, ma'am." Then to the table at large. "Poor Sir Roderick, before he died, consumed great quantities of sugar. I have sometimes fancied it may have hastened his end." This ended the first skirmish. A certain gloom of manner and a pause was considered due to the sacred memory of Sir Roderick. "George," my mother said, "don't kick the chair." Then, perhaps, Mrs. Booch would produce a favourite piece from her repertoire. "The evenings are drawing out nicely," she would say. Or, if the season was decadent, "How the evenings draw in!" It was an invaluable remark to her. I do not know how she would have got along without it. My mother, who sat with her back to the window, would always consider it due to Mrs. Booch to turn around and regard the evening in the act of elongation or contraction, whichever phase it might be. A brisk discussion of how long we were to the longest or shortest day would ensue, and die away at last exhausted. Mrs. Mackridge, perhaps, would reopen. She had many intelligent habits. Among others, she read the paper, the Morning Post. The other ladies would at times tackle that sheet, but only to read the births, marriages, and deaths on the front page. It was, of course, the old Morning Post that cost threepence, not the brisk, coruscating young thing of to-day. "They say," she would open, "that Lord Tweedums is to go to Canada." "Ah," said Mr. Rabbits, "do they?" "Isn't he," said my mother, "the Earl of Slumgold's cousin?" She knew he was. It was an entirely irrelevant and unnecessary remark, but still something to say. "The same, ma'am," said Mrs. Mackridge. "They say he was extremely popular in New South Wales. They looked up to him greatly. I knew him, ma'am, as a young man. A very nice, pleasant young fellow." Interlude of respect. "His predecessor," said Rabbits, who had acquired from some clerical model a precise, emphatic articulation, without acquiring at the same time the aspirates that would have graced it, "got into trouble at Sydney." "Huh!" said Mrs. Mackridge scornfully. "So I'm told." "He came to Templemorton after he came back, and I remember them talking him over after he'd gone again." "Huh!" said Mrs. Mackridge, interrogatively. "His fuss was quoting poetry, ma'am. He said, what was it he said? They left their country for their country's good, which in some way was took to remind them of their being originally convicts, though now reformed. Every one I heard speak agreed it was tactless of him." "Sir Roderick used to say," said Mrs. Mackridge, "that the first thing—" Here Mrs. Mackridge paused and looked dreadfully at me. "And the second thing—" Here she fixed me again. "And the third thing—" Now I was released. "Needed in a colonial governor is tact." She became aware of my doubts again, and added predominantly, "It has always struck me that that was a singularly true remark." I resolved that if ever I found this polypus of tact growing up in my soul, I would tear it out by the roots, throw it forth, and stamp on it. "They're queer people, colonials," said Rabbits, "very queer. When I was at Temple Morton, I see something of 'em. Queer fellows, some of 'em. Very respectful, of course, free with their money in a spamsomate sort of way, but some of 'em, I must confess, make me nervous. They have an eye on you. They watch you as you wait. They let themselves appear to be looking at you. My mother said nothing in that discussion. The word colonies always upset her. She was afraid, I think, that if she turned her mind in that direction, my errant father might suddenly and shockingly be discovered, no doubt conspicuously bigamic, and altogether offensive and revolutionary. She did not want to rediscover my father at all. It is curious that when I was a little listening boy, I had such an idea of our colonies that I jeered in my heart at Mrs. Mackridge's colonial ascendancy. These brave, emancipated, sunburned English of the open, I thought, suffer these aristocratic invaders as a quaint anachronism. But as for being gratified, I don't jeer now. I'm not so sure. Part 5. It is a little difficult to explain why I did not come to do what was the natural thing for anyone in my circumstances to do, and take my world for granted. A certain innate scepticism, I think, explains it, and a certain inaptitude for sympathetic assimilation. My father, I believe, was a sceptic. My mother was certainly a hard woman. I was an only child, and to this day I do not know whether my father is living or dead. He fled my mother's virtues before my distincter memories began. He left no traces in his flight, and she, in her indignation, destroyed every vestige that she could of him. Never a photograph nor a scrap of his handwriting have I seen, and it was, I know, only the accepted code of virtue and discretion that prevented her destroying her marriage certificate and me, and so making a clean sweep of her matrimonial humiliation. I suppose I must inherit something of the moral stupidity that would enable her to make a holocaust of every little personal thing she had of him. There must have been presents made by him as a lover, for example, books with kindly inscriptions, letters perhaps, a flattened flower, a ring, or such like gage. She kept her wedding ring, of course, but all the others she destroyed. She never told me his Christian name, or indeed spoke a word to me of him, though at times I came near daring to ask her. And what I have of him, it isn't much, I got from his brother, my hero, my Uncle Ponderevo. She wore her ring, marriage certificate she kept in a sealed envelope in the very bottom of her largest trunk, and me she sustained at a private school among the Kentish hills. You must not think I was always at Bladesover, even in my holidays. If at the time these came around Lady Drew was vexed by recent company, or for any other reason wished to take it out of my mother, then she used to ignore the customary reminder my mother gave her that I stayed on at the school. But such occasions were rare, and I suppose that between 10 and 14 I averaged 50 days a year at Bladesover. Don't imagine I deny that was a fine thing for me. Bladesover, in absorbing the whole countryside, had not altogether missed greatness. The Bladesover system has at least done one good thing for England. It has abolished the peasant habit of mind. If many of us still live and breathe pantry and housekeeper's room, we are quit of the dream of living by economizing parasitically on hens and pigs. About that park there were some elements of a liberal education. There was a great space of greensward not given over to manure and food grubbing. There was mystery. There was matter for the imagination. It was still a park of deer. I saw something of the life of these dappled creatures, heard the belling of stags, came upon young fawns among the bracken, found bones, skulls, and antlers in lonely places. There were corners that gave a gleam of meaning to the word forest, glimpses of unstudied natural splendor. There was a slope of bluebells in the broken sunlight under the newly green beeches in the westwood that is now precious sapphire in my memory. It was the first time that I knowingly met beauty. And in the house there were books. The rubbish old lady Drew read I never saw, stuff of the Maria Monk type, I have since gathered, had a fascination for her. But back in the past there had been a Drew of intellectual enterprise, Sir Cuthbert, the son of Sir Matthew, who built the house, and thrust away, neglected and despised, in an old room upstairs, were books and treasures of his that my mother let me rout among during a spell of wintry wet. Sitting under a dormer window on a shelf above great stores of tea and spices, I became familiar with much of Hogarth in a big portfolio. With Raphael there was a great book of engravings from the stanzas of Raphael in the Vatican, and with most of the capitals of Europe as they looked about 1780, by means of several pig-iron moulded books of views. There was also a broad 18th century atlas, with huge wandering maps that instructed me mightily. It had splendid adornments about each map title. Holland showed a fisherman and his boat. Russia, a Cossack. Japan, remarkable people attired in pagodas. I say it deliberately, pagodas. There were terrae incognitae in every continent then. Poland, Sarmatia, lands since lost, and many a voyage I made with a blunted pen about that large, incorrect, and dignified world. The books in that little old closet had been banished, I suppose, from the saloon during the Victorian revival of good taste and emasculated orthodoxy, but my mother had no suspicion of their character. So I read and understood the good sound rhetoric of Tom Paine's Rights of Man and his Common Sense. Excellent books, once praised by bishops, and since sedulously lied about. Gulliver was there, unexpurgated, strong meat for a boy, perhaps, but not too strong, I hold. I have never regretted that I escaped niceness in these affairs. The satire of Traldragdub made my blood boil, as it was meant to do, but I hated Swift for the Houyhnhnms, and never quite liked a horse afterwards. Then I remember also a translation of Voltaire's Candide and Rasselas, and vast book though it was, I really believe I read, in a muzzy sort of way, of course, from end to end, and even with some reference now and then to the Atlas, Gibbon, in 12 volumes. These readings whetted my taste for more, and surreptitiously I raided the bookcases in the big saloon. I got through quite a number of books before my sacrilegious temerity was discovered by Anne, the old head housemaid. I remember that among others I tried a translation of Plato's Republic then, and found extraordinary little interest in it. I was much too young for that. But Vathek was glorious stuff. That kicking affair, when everybody had to kick. The thought of Vathek always brings back with it my boyish memory of the big saloon in Bladesover. It was a huge, long room with many windows opening upon the park, and each window, there were a dozen or more, reaching from the floor up, had its elaborate silk or satin curtains, heavily fringed, a canopy, above, its completely white shutters folding into the deep thickness of the wall. At either end of that great still place was an immense marble chimney-piece. The end by the bookcase showed the wolf and Romulus and Remus, with Homer and Virgil for supporters. The design at the other end I have forgotten. Frederick, Prince of Wales, swaggered flatly over the one, twice life-size, but mellowed by the surface gleam of oil, and over the other was an equally colossal group of departed Drews, as sylvan deities, scantily clad against a storm-rent sky. Down the centre of the elaborate ceiling were 3 chandeliers, each bearing some hundreds of dangling glass lustres, and over the interminable carpet It impressed me as about as big as Sarmatia in the storeroom atlas, were islands and archipelagos of chintz-covered chairs and couches, tables, great Sèvres vases on pedestals, a bronze man, and a horse. Somewhere in this wilderness one came, I remember, upon a big harp beside a lyre-shaped music-stand and a grand piano. The book-borrowing raid was one of extraordinary dash and danger. One came down the main service stairs. That was legal, and illegality began in a little landing where, very cautiously, one went through a red baize door. A little passage led to the hall, and here one reconnoitred for Anne, the old head housemaid. The younger housemaids were friendly and did not count. Anne located, came a dash across the open space at the foot of that great staircase that has never been properly descended since powder went out of fashion, and so to the saloon door. A beast of an oscillating Chinaman in china as large as life grimaced and quivered to one's lightest steps. That door was the perilous place. It was double with the thickness of the wall between, so that one could not listen beforehand for the whisk of the feather brush on the other side. Oddly rat-like, is it not, this darting into enormous places in pursuit of the abandoned crumbs of thought? And I found Langhorne's Plutarch, too. I remember on those shelves. It seems queer to me now to think that I acquired pride and self-respect, the idea of a state and the germ of public spirit, in such a furtive fashion. Queer, too, that it should rest with an old Greek, dead these 1800 years to teach that. Part 6. The school I went to was the sort of school the Bladesover system permitted. The public schools that add comic into existence in the brief glow of the Renaissance had been taken possession of by the ruling class. The lower classes were not supposed to stand in need of schools, and our middle stratum got the schools it deserved, private schools, schools any unqualified pretender was free to establish. Mine was kept by a man who had had the energy to get himself a College of Preceptors diploma, and considering how cheap his charges were, I will readily admit the place might have been worse. The building was a dingy yellow brick residence outside the village, with the schoolroom as an outbuilding of lath and plaster. I do not remember that my school days were unhappy. Indeed, I recall a good lot of fine mixed fun in them. But I cannot, without grave risk of misinterpretation, declare that we were at all nice and refined. We fought much, not sound formal fighting, but scrapping of a sincere and murderous kind, into which one might bring one's boots. It made us tough, at any rate, and several of us were the sons of London publicans, who distinguished scraps where one meant to hurt from ordered pugilism, practising both arts, and having, moreover, precocious linguistic gifts. Our cricket field was bald about the wickets, and we played without style and disputed with the umpire, and the teaching was chiefly in the hands of a lout of 19 who wore ready-made clothes and taught despicably. The headmaster and proprietor taught us arithmetic, algebra, and Euclid, and to the older boys even trigonometry. Himself he had a strong mathematical bias, and I think now that by the standard of a British public school he did rather well by us. We had one inestimable privilege at that school, and that was spiritual neglect. We dealt with one another with the forcible simplicity of natural boys. We cheeked and punched and clouted. We thought ourselves Red Indians and cowboys and such like honourable things, and not young English gentlemen. We never felt the strain of onward Christian soldiers, nor were swayed by any premature piety in the cold oak pew of our Sunday devotions. All that was good. We spent our rare pennies in the uncensored reading matter of the village dame's shop, on the Boys of England, and honest penny dreadfuls, ripping stuff that anticipated Haggard and Stevenson. badly printed and queerly illustrated, and very, very good for us. On our half holidays, we were allowed the unusual freedom of rambling in twos and threes wide and far about the land, talking experimentally, dreaming wildly. There was much in those walks. To this day, the landscape of the Kentish world, with its low, broad distances, its hop gardens and golden stretches of wheat, its oasts and square church towers, its background of downland and hangars, has for me a faint sense of adventure added to the pleasure of its beauty. We smoked on occasion, but nobody put us up to the proper boyish things to do. We never robbed an orchard, for example, though there were orchards all about us. We thought stealing was sinful. We stole incidental apples and turnips and strawberries from the fields indeed, but in a criminal inglorious fashion, and afterwards we were ashamed. We had our days of adventure, but they were natural accidents, our own adventures. There was one hot day when several of us, walking out towards Maidstone, were incited by the devil to despise ginger beer, and we fuddled ourselves dreadfully with ale, and a time when our young minds were infected to the pitch of buying pistols by the legend of the Wild West. Young Roots from Highbury came back with a revolver and cartridges, and we went off 6 strong to live a free wild life one holiday afternoon. We fired our first shot deep in the old flint mine at Chiselstead, and nearly burst our eardrums. Then we fired at a primrose studded wood by Pickthorn Green, and I gave a false alarm of keeper, and we fled in disorder for a mile. After which Roots suddenly shot at a pheasant in the high road by Chiselstead, and then young Barker told lies about the severity of the game laws, and made Roots sore afraid, and we hid the pistol in a dry ditch outside the school field. A day or so after we got in again, and ignoring a certain fouling and rusting of the barrel, tried for a rabbit at 300 yards. Young Roots blew a molehill at 20 paces into a dust cloud, burnt his fingers, and scorched his face, and the weapon having once displayed this strange disposition to flame back upon the shooter, was not subsequently fired. One main source of excitement for us was cheeking people in vans and carts upon the Goudhurst road, and getting myself into a monstrous white mess in the chalk pits beyond the village, and catching yellow jaundice as a sequel to bathing stark naked with 3 other Adamites, old Ewart leading that function, in the rivulet across Hickson's Meadows, are among my memorabilia. Those free, imaginative afternoons! How much they were for us! How much they did for us! All streams came from the then undiscovered sources of the Nile in those days. All thickets were Indian jungles, and our best game, I say with pride, I invented. I got it out of the Bladesover saloon. We found a wood where trespassing was forbidden, and did the retreat of the 10,000 through it from end to end, cutting our way bravely through a host of nettle beds that barred our path, and not forgetting to weep and kneel when at last we emerged within sight of the high road sea. So we have burst at times, weeping and rejoicing upon startled wayfarers. Usually I took the part of that distinguished General Xenophon, and please note the quantity of the O. I have all my classical names like that. Socrates rhymes with Bates for me, and except when the bleak eye of some scholar warns me of his standards of judgment, I use those dear old mispronunciations still. The little splash into Latin made during my days as a chemist washed off nothing of the habit. Well, if I met those great gentlemen of the past with their accents carelessly adjusted, I did at least meet them alive, as an equal, and in a living tongue. Altogether, my school might easily have been worse for me, and among other good things it gave me a friend who has lasted my life out. This was Ewart, who is now a monumental artist at Woking, after many vicissitudes. Dear chap! How he did stick out of his clothes, to be sure! He was a long-limbed lout, ridiculously tall beside my more youthful compactness, and except that there was no black moustache under his nose blob, he had the same round, knobby face as he has today, the same bright and active hazel brown eyes, the stare, the meditative moment, the insinuating reply. Surely no boy ever played the fool as Bob Ewart used to play it. No boy had a readier knack of mantling the world with wonder. Commonness vanished before Ewart. At his expository touch all things became memorable and rare. From him I first heard tell of love, but only after its barbs were already sticking in my heart. He was, I know now, the bastard of the great improvident artist Rickman Ewart. He brought the light of a lax world that at least had not turned its back upon beauty into the growing fermentation of my mind. I won his heart by a version of Vathek, and after that we were inseparable yarning friends. We merged our intellectual stock so completely that I wonder sometimes how much I did not become Ewart, how much Ewart is not vicariously and derivatively me. End of Book the First, Chapter the First, Parts 4 through 6.